This is a book that I wrote. It's called The Lightcap. It's a, first of all, thanks to Nana for opening up her bookstore to me. Appreciate it very much. This is the first novel that I've ever written. It is a science fiction novel because that's what I personally enjoy. So when I set out to write one, I figured, they say write what you know, and I've read a lot of science fiction in my life. I tried really hard to make something that is, I feel like that it's pretty much impossible to create something that's completely unique. It's pretty much everything is a derivative of something else. So for me, I think some of the influences for this book were like Philip K. Dick stories, if you've ever read any Philip K. Dick. Neil Stephenson is another big influence of mine. I really like the exploring the idea of what will happen if our current system were to continue into the future. And so in the book, one of the central themes in the area where the character lives is that it is owned by a company, a single company that is a large monolithic entity that controls pretty much every aspect of what we would consider to be government life now. So courts, police officers, legislation, they control everything. I wrote a chapter called Election Night, and I'm going to read from that chapter first. I'm not going to read the whole thing, just some parts to kind of give some insight into the world at large. The character lives in what is known as Metro region. It composes about the upper 50% of the current eastern seaboard of the United States. It is... the character lives in, it's called New Metro City. It used to be New York City. And where the character lives, it's... yeah, I'm just going to read it. Oh, and yes, right before this, so there's kind of a mysterious man that I'm not going to touch too much on that in the reading tonight, but there's a kind of a, in the first half of the book, it's a recurring thing where the character sees this guy. He's not entirely sure if the guy is even real, or if he's just sort of imagining him, or if it's like if it's some kind of imagery, suggesting something else, some kind of unconscious manifestation or something like that. So he just saw him right before this, and so the beginning of the chapter opens with him trying to figure out what's going on. He was on the subway. Adam slipped his fingers through rubber as he pried the doors apart. They seemed to open painfully slowly to Adam, who desperately wanted out. He sprinted 10 blocks back to the last stop with long strides, dress shoes striking against concrete, syncopated by the rhythmic thwack of his messenger bag against his back. There was no sign of the man. Adam struggled to catch his breath, hands on his knees, then drew odd stares as he tried to fill his lungs with air while spinning around to examine each face in the crowd. After giving up in bewildered frustration, Adam started to walk toward home, wondering if he had imagined it all. He had been under a great deal of stress lately, and it had been his first day with the Lightcap. These were the only explanations he could fathom. It was either that, or he was losing his mind. Probably both, came the thought, unbidden. Adam's adrenaline was still pumping from his earlier sprint, so he decided not to go home. It was election night, both in the remaining states and the corp regions. Large crowds usually gathered at bars, playing drinking games and placing bets on how public and executive positions would be awarded. The election system had been modified to apply the Metrocorp Charter of Incorporation onto the democratic framework its citizens expected, a holdover from their time as separate states under the banner of a federal government. In those days, it had been one person, one vote, Adam knew from school. A terribly unfair system, his teacher had said with a shudder. Just think of how unlikely it would be for actual merit to be rewarded. Under the new Metro Charter, however, each citizen of the region was given one voting share per year after eligibility, with the option to purchase more shares at the current trading rate. In principle, good work was rewarded with more say in government. In practice, poor people sold their vote on the first day of eligibility, which was still the 18th birthday, as was tradition. The last time Adam checked, a single share sold for 200 credits, enough for 3 to 4 weeks of frugal meals. The rich hoarded their shares and bought many more, and had come to account for nearly 40% of the votes cast in the metro region. Fortunately, the system was impossible to rig due to strong biometric security. Actual votes were still necessary to win, and anyone with enough credits could buy shares. Alliances formed among the diminished middle class, the people who had worked and lived paycheck to paycheck, along with other voting blocs such as the racial and ethnic minorities, the elderly, and the poor who retained and consolidated their voting shares. For decades before the collapses of the states, people had been urged to vote with their ballots and their pocketbooks. Now they really did vote with their money, and those with the most money got the most votes. Adam had never been political, though he still voted. Most did, since it was easy, and if they didn't vote, they'd sell to someone who would. Adam didn't see the point of getting involved in things that were ultimately out of his control, especially because of the unnecessary drama of it all. Election night had turned into an occasion to celebrate or to drown sorrows. Regardless of the outcome, there was an excuse to party, to drink, and to curse the other side, that terrible separate half of society who were too stupid to see things the right way. It seemed odd to Adam that most elections were evenly split. 40% of the votes were usually for the most pro-business candidate, who somehow convinced another 10% or so of the voting public to go along with him or her, either through a barrage of false ads or by paying the media for positive coverage. Many theories from many sources. Adam headed to Hanley's, a place he'd seen featured on several ad screens that showed whatever spectacles were on the video nodes each night. Why watch the big game, execution, or election in the privacy of your own home when one could go to Hanley's, spend 400 credits, and not remember any of it? It struck Adam that alcohol could be considered the original Lightcap, but with dangerous side effects. So he goes into a bar, and sort of like a seedy place, but kind of like a sports bar, but with about 10 times as many screens everywhere. Kind of like screens on every available vertical surface, is sort of like a real overload of the senses to be in there. And so he's in there, and as he's kind of just watching, he's sort of kind of watching how people react to different things on the news as election results are coming in. I actually wrote this on our election night this last year, so some of the stuff is like taken from actual news broadcasts on election night. Adam picked up his glass, slowly swirled the scotch in it, and looked around the bar. Most faces were turned with rapt attention to the bar's screens, which showed animated maps of the region, each precinct lighted with blue or red depending on which candidate, the one who was pro-business or the one who was very pro-business, was leading or had won. In some cases, only a few ballots had been counted, which led to them reporting absolutely nothing, saying things like, "Too close to call," and "This is just a projection. Only 2% of the polls have closed." Someone had evidently decided these statements sounded better than, "We have nothing to report." The news could never stop, even if there were no stories to cover, because it would cause a drop in ratings. Actually, the news stopping would itself be news. Anything was more interesting than dead air. Adam watched each screen briefly, more interested in how people responded to the news than the news itself. Groups of patrons cheered or wailed, then he noticed a group that had occasionally done the opposite. Words were traded, and in some cases the thick-necked bouncers stepped forward with menacing faces, unspoken warnings of their potential intervention. Already an excuse to party, politics had become an excuse to brawl. If you can't beat your opponents in the tally, beat them in the streets, was the motto of many. The bouncers were there to keep beatings from occurring for the sake of the bar's insurance policy, not out of any sense of obligation to customers. Money bought and paid for both candidates, corporate stooges to their cores. People were, after all, voting for the executive head of the second largest corporate region in the world after the Cascadia Corporation, which owned the former west coast of the United States and a few other contiguous properties. The elections that night took place in the regions of Metro and Cascadia, the Confederated Republic of Texas, Confederacy for short, and what was left of the United States, a conical-shaped chunk of land starting northeast of the District of Columbia and spreading west beyond Colorado. The media companies operating in each region had some degree of crossover between board members, as if forming a Venn diagram of influence and power, overlapping areas containing the richest of the rich who made money off everyone else. Having 4 major elections all within the same night created an ideal situation for ratings. Election night became the most watched video event of every 5th year. Even those who had sold their votes liked to watch, to be caught up in the excitement of the crowd, to be parts of something. Adam worked through 4 glasses of scotch and quietly watched as race after district race was called, trying to guess which group of patrons would grumble or celebrate. The screens had shown each incremental update, with 78% of stations report, "No wait, 79!" Numbers traded back and forth, one candidate robbed of the lead by another. The crowd was frantic, brought from ecstasy to agony and back every few minutes. The first race announced was that of the CEO position for Cascadia Corporation, whose incumbent won re-election. The second race decided was the president of the Confederacy. A staunch pro-business challenger unseated the sitting president, a theocratic isolationist with dreams of kickstarting Armageddon. The third was that of President of the United States, who drew attention due to nostalgia and a small amount of pity. The incumbent's challenger lost, failing to make an effective case for his economic recovery plan. The status quo remained for the most part unchanged. Adam was satisfied, if not affected, in any way by these results. A silence fell over the crowd. The newscaster, with his expensive suit and well-coiffed hair, dramatically turned to face the camera. With agonizingly slow delivery, the man recited his opening lead into the election results for Metrocorp, as elbows jostled and necks craned to get the best view. Does the act of observation affect the outcome, Adam wondered? No, he thought to himself as he downed the last of his scotch. There are no such things as quantum elections. The patrons groaned and cheered loudly in response to the results. The exceptionally business-friendly candidate, Tim Monterey, had unseated the current CEO, Paul Dewey, who had failed to generate profit at a quick enough pace. The current CEO had focused instead on using a portion of the excess to reinvest in infrastructure and pay outstanding debts, acts for which he had now been punished. The screen cut to the smug face of the victor, Tim Monterey, who began delivering his acceptance speech. The energy in the bar started to remind Adam of the cold pressure before a sudden rainstorm. He got up about the same time the first punch was thrown, by an angry, red-faced man who bounded to a cheering man and punched him in the face. The surprised victim fell back. At the same moment, his friends pushed away from the table and converged on the attacker. The attacker's mates were just a step behind. This is a quick storm, Adam mused. Glad I was paying attention. Adam was halfway to the door by the time the fight had begun to ripple through the crowd, a shockwave of destruction sent from the center of the room. He was hit by a bottle, but it bounced harmlessly off his bony shoulder and back into the crowd. Thank goodness for unbreakable glass, he thought. Adam's lean frame was able to pass unhindered between people, and he made it to the door just as the bouncer from outside became aware of what was happening. Adam reached the door right as the bouncer opened it, a look of surprise on his face as he served his unplanned doorman. The bouncer's wide shoulders took up almost the entire width of the door frame, leaving just enough room. Thanks, Adam said as he slipped through, but the bouncer was gone, his attention already turned to the riotous crowd threatening to overrun his burly fellows. If the team of 10 bouncers weren't able to quell the crowd's chaotic energy, the blues would be called. Adam wasn't a fighter, so he had no desire to stay. Due to his distaste for the blues, he was doubly glad he made it out with minimal incident.